Namaste. We at Kali's Brood have begun a tweet series focusing on Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga. One of our very first tweets went out today morning, 1st Jan 2020 at 9 a.m. And one of the questions that I received was, how do you read Sri Aurobindo? Right? Because if you look at it, Synthesis of Yoga, for example, is not a small book. It's pretty thick, and people always have this impression that Sri Aurobindo is hard to read. You can't understand him. It's too many words, and so on and so forth. So what we at Kali's Brood thought of was to do this little video where we share our thoughts in terms of how to read Sri Aurobindo. What are the techniques that have worked for us? Now, when we talk about reading Sri Aurobindo, and in this particular case it's Synthesis of Yoga that we are going to cover, we need to step back and get a sort of broader context. What's the context in which you are coming, or in which this book has been written? Who is Sri Aurobindo? There's a whole bunch of questions. There's a bunch of open context, right? So I want to sort of take some time to define that context, so that you may understand where we as sadhaks of Sri Aurobindo's yoga are coming from, and how you may, if you're unfamiliar, may follow this template, this approach in looking at the master's work. So let me begin. This is going to be a little long, so just please bear with me, but it will make sense eventually by the time I finish this conversation. Let's start right at the beginning, right? Speech, human speech, is a fundamental trait of a human, right? We speak, we think. Speech is the mechanism by which we communicate with each other, right? Speech is a fundamental trait. But this fundamental trait is not unique to man, because even animals speak. They have their own language. But what makes human speech different, or of a higher order than animal talk? Because in human speech, we not only just communicate to perform the basic functions of life, but we also we are very methodical. We have a method and an approach, and this seems to be a consequence of the way our minds have evolved, as opposed to, or as compared to, what an animal might do. An animal has a mind, but it's largely driven by instinct. The mind has not taken a proper shape, so to speak. It hasn't evolved. But in humans, mind has acquired a level of sophistication where it can consciously use this tool of speech and language to be able to discuss about higher order things. So, right? So what are we looking at? We humans tend to use language as a means to articulate, express, and transmit knowledge, right? To transmit knowledge. This knowledge could be of many means. It could be about something that's happening within me, something that I've observed outside, many different uses that we put language to. So it shows that language is a sort of vehicle so that human minds can acquire knowledge that it hasn't had before and speak about it, right? So from speech, we have come to this abstraction of a language. Language as a means to transmit knowledge. But what do we mean by knowledge? What is this knowledge? Knowledge, as it's conventionally understood, is only an opinion, right? I know this is a sort of controversial thing to say, but take science for instance. Science makes some observations, it builds a certain model, it says this is the way the world works. A newer theory comes along and what was considered knowledge, absolute knowledge, up until a certain point, has grown, evolved, and you say, okay, no, that was not knowledge, it was insufficient or even wrong, and you get to a new knowledge, right? So basically, knowledge is only an opinion or an observed cause and effect that holds true in a certain time and space, which means that you could consider, coming from, let's say, any other part of the world other than Bangalore, India, you could hold some cultural truths, some religious truths, some spiritual truths. You could say that, this is utterly true in my context because all the people whom I live with have similar opinions. Now, I could come and declare exactly the opposite, right? Because in my context, this is different. So, we see that all knowledge is provisional. Its utility is sort of fairly limited, right? Now, if we come to this conclusion that knowledge is provisional, why at all bother taking the trouble to read anything? Why pursue? Why acquire knowledge? Now, here's the thing. Now, we acquire knowledge as humans so that eventually we may experience something. Now, this is a sort of a big deal. So imagine you're going through a food brochure. You read the brochure, you see the sort of foods that are available in that particular restaurant. There are good pictures, there's fancy descriptions. You can almost taste the food based on the descriptions that are given. But all of this doesn't matter unless you go eat the food there someday, right? So you pursued that bit of knowledge so that you may eventually have the experience of that. Now, why am I making a point about this? Any knowledge that you acquire, as we just mentioned, the knowledge is just a provisional thing. It's a trailer, it's a hint of what it is, but not the actual experience. It is experience for which we as human beings live. We live for that experience. Now, just bear this point in mind, right? So, back to our initial topic, right? So, we are here to read, or rather follow, Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga. Now, one could argue that this is one book of many, and you would be fair, you would be right in your opinion. There are many kinds of books in the world, and books are sort of these little packets of knowledge, of experience that have been captured by a certain author, right? Now, we can reason, we can conclude that every book that has ever been written is the product of the author's mind. The author has seen something, he has understood something, and he communicates whatever he has discovered in his book. Now, that should be very simple for anyone to understand. But if we think about it a little more, we could say that an author's level of experience of this world, of himself, what are the heights to which he has gone, what are the breadths that he has explored, what are the depths of human experience that he has gone through. All of this in some way goes to shape the book that he writes, right? Now, for example, I'm going to take a couple of examples, right? Two concrete examples. One is Darwin's Origin of Species, right? One sort of a book. Then we'll look at the second sort of book, let's say the Bhagavad Gita, right? Now both of these books hold some sort of a knowledge. They have some utility, but there is a difference between them. So let's spend a couple of seconds, a couple of moments going through what this difference is. In reading Darwin's Origin of Species, you understand something of the evolutionary steps that has brought man, us, you, me, here to this level of sophistication or whatever, right? How did they do that? They did that by observing various fossils. They studied the anatomy, they studied the forms, and they concluded, life has been evolving step by step, and it has come up until man, which is us. There's one sort of knowledge. You got data, Now you do not know why this evolution happened, where is it headed, what is that impulse which drove this whole thing forward. That we do not know. Darwin doesn't get into it, right? So, but still, there's one sort of knowledge. You have made some observation and you have made a hypothesis and you said, this is my understanding. That's what Darwin did. Now let's come to the Bhagavad Gita, right? When you hear the Gita, or when you study the Gita, and when you perform the discipline that's necessary or needed to be done by Arjuna, as instructed by Sri Krishna, you realize that this knowledge leads you to a state of being, a newer state of being. There are things that are happening within you in performing the discipline of the Gita, which is sort of understandable at one level, but at another level you see that this knowledge that Sri Krishna gave you has remade you in some fashion. It has not only given you some knowledge, but you find your consciousness changing, actively changing, right? So at a very basic level, we could say that there are gradations of knowledge. There is knowledge that is mere opinion or a fact that is relevant for a certain point in time and space. But there is another sort of knowledge which can actively remake you, give you a different experience, give you new set of faculties that open up in you when you pursue the yoga of the Gita, right? So at a very basic level, let's say there are these two types of knowledge. Now, what did we say initially? We pursue knowledge so that we may have experience, right? So the knowledge of the Gita leads you to the experience of your own innermost self and much more, right? So in a way, I would say the purpose of existence is to have experience, and the knowledge of the Gita gets you to have some of these very high, very rare experiences, of what we will get into later. But that's the basic benchmark, right? On why we have to read, because we want to get experience. And there are different sorts of books, and each sort of book gives you either just plain information or leads you to experience. So just bear that in mind. So let's come back to Sri Aurobindo, right? So Sri Aurobindo, for those of you who may not know, is known in many different ways by many different people. Some call him a patriot, some call him a freedom fighter, some say he's a poet, some say he's a politician, some say he's a sage, and many more. But if you have pursued trying to read his works, you see that all these are only facets of who he was. He seems to have been much more. So in a way, you could say that it's as if, if you were a mountaineer and you're climbing the Himalayas, you reach a certain peak, gasping for breath, and you look up and you see that there are still more higher peaks, and you go to the next peak, it's still more higher. Sri Aurobindo is like that, right? There's so much to explore, and we are choosing a starting point that's sort of available to us, right, at most basic level. But there's another aspect to Sri Aurobindo. Now that aspect was, he did not write any of his works because he was imagining this. He wrote rather from self-experience. Now, why do I say that? Now we know that he pursued his own yoga, he had his experiences and so on. Now he didn't go writing commentaries because he read some yogic work manual and he was giving his opinions of it. No. When he wrote the Gita, he exactly knew what he was doing, right? He had experiences of Sri Krishna. He had gone through all the states. He was writing because he knew by experience that it was so, and he was not speculating, right? That's a very important point to make. That's what distinguishes from someone like, let's say, Radhakrishnan writing commentary on the Upanishads. I mean, the dude had practically no sadhana, right? And yet he's writing commentary widely acclaimed according to normal population. Widely acclaimed commentaries on the Upanishads. That's one of the most silliest thing to do. I'm an engineer supposedly by profession. That's the work that I do. But if I were to write a manual on, let's say, human anatomy, would you read it? You would say, dude, you have no domain experience. You're not supposed to talk about these things, right? But India being what it is, and Hindus being what they are, tend to give credence to people who have no business talking about domains that they don't understand. So, Sri Aurobindo's work, all that he has written, has issued from self-experience, right? Now, because he has experienced it, we can assume safely that the synthesis of yoga, this particular book, is not a normal, everyday book that he had written. We can safely assume that Sri Aurobindo knows what he's speaking of, and this particular book, which covers the entire terrain of the traditional yoga systems as we know it, and lifts it up many notches further, where he brings in his integral yoga. He introduces his integral yoga. He places integral yoga in the landscape of the whole yogic discipline, and he takes you through a certain passage. Now, this is a complex book. It is a difficult book, but we at Kali's Brood wanted to introduce people who might not be familiar with Sri Aurobindo or with the synthesis of yoga. We want to take you on a little journey through, again, as I said, very simple tweets, text that is selected from his work with whatever Sri Aurobindo has written, but accompanied by commentaries, let's say, so to speak, from our end, either as video or as text, which we will share on Twitter and on this particular channel on YouTube. So, we know that we can expect something big from this work. Now to the title of this video itself. How should you read Sri Aurobindo? Right? As I mentioned earlier, many people say that he's difficult to read, his language is tough, too many words, etc., etc. But in our experience, we have found out that there are some simple techniques, poises rather, that you could take that eases the process up very, very greatly. Right? So, remember that whole thread. We are going to acquire some knowledge, and through this knowledge perhaps some experience. We know the author has had experiences of these states. This is not speculation he's doing, but he's actually recounting, restating whatever experiences he had gone through, right? So what is the poise from which we can or we may approach this work? Now, one of the things, the mother speaks about this, and the master also. But what we have found is the mindset or attitude that works the best when you approach Sri Aurobindo is to be open mentally, right? First of all, don't make any assumptions. You could be an atheist, you could be a Advaitin by philosophy, you could be a Dvaitin, you could be any one of these 1,000 different variations of life philosophy or spiritual philosophy that you adhere to. It doesn't matter. Just have an open mind, right? If you, the best way to begin, with which, like, say, someone like me, we at Kali's Brood had begun was, we are dumb, we know nothing, right? That's how we began. right? Have an open mind. Read the arguments, the train of thought that Sri Aurobindo takes you through. Just follow, just mentally. You don't have to, do not, the critical thinking can come later, but your first step is to keep your mind plastic, be open in your mind, just receive, go along with him for that journey that he's taking you, and by proxy that we are taking you through, we will take you through, right? Just follow it. Now, there's going to be a whole series of ideas that he's going to plant in your head, and these are like little seeds that are going to go sit there, right? Let them be, just let them sit. And all of these little seeds or sparks of little light, they're all going to give you a certain amount of knowledge. Now remember what we said about knowledge. Knowledge is provisional. Apply that same yardstick even to Sri Aurobindo. He's giving you a certain knowledge, you're receiving that certain knowledge, but as we said, knowledge is provisional. Hold it in that fashion. No harm, no offense, it's just the way it should be, right? Now, once you have acquired this piece of knowledge, let's say you have read a chapter or a passage, the next thing that you do is to contemplate on it, think about it. Now, what do I mean by think about it? When Sri Aurobindo makes a certain assertion, right? You pursue his line of thought. Now, when it's as if, he is throwing a torchlight on a particular area, now you observe that area, whatever he has pointed out, observe it carefully, see what he is trying to tell you, but then add your thinking. You say, okay, what is outside the periphery of that area that he's showing a light on? What's around it? What's below it? What's above it? Now think through that, right? Now it's a very simple exercise. It's not complex. Even a high school kid should be able to perform that thought process. Now this is essential because when he gives you 2 or 3 pieces of information, you need to know how that information could be integrated in your understanding. It's a very essential step. But even while you do that, remember what we said earlier, that knowledge is still provisional. Hold it so, but see how it can come and relate to the various ideas that you might have, right? Now, this is the most, as I said, this is the second step that you do. Receive the knowledge in an open plastic mind, then see how things are connected to each other, how it connects to you, how you could relate to it, and so on. Now, this has to be done for a period of time where it becomes what I would call as a default poise in your consciousness. There comes a time where, because of repeated practice, you read it and there's a set of integrations, associations that are happening in your mind based on the data that he had given. Now that has to become sort of automatic almost, right? So which means that you read a passage, you spend 3-4 let's say a handful of moments, and in those moments there are literally let's say hundreds of churnings that are happening in your head, and in a good way. They're all getting connected. Something is associated with something else, and you understand something, you don't seem to understand something. But through this entire process, you must remember, this is just knowledge. You haven't arrived at experience as it, right? You could perhaps have understood enough to write essays, blog posts, talk about it for hours. All of that doesn't matter. You have read Sri Aurobindo, you have understood something of him, but you are yet to have the experience, right? Now, how do we go from knowledge to experience, right? That's what we are here for, remember, right? That's what we exist for, experience. Now, here's where you will have to bring the third element to the table, and that third element is aspiration. Now, aspiration could take many forms, and I'm going to make it really easy for you, right? Now, what do I mean by easy? Aspiration at the highest levels could be Meera aspiring for Sri Krishna, or Arjuna aspiring for a code of conduct or to Sri Krishna. It could be at that top level. But aspiration could also be intellectual curiosity. right? It could be something very, very simple. You're just curious. You just want to know what is there in this book. It could be as simple as that. You don't have to break your head. There is no danger of disrespect to Sri Aurobindo. There is no notion of blasphemy. None of those big words. Don't bother. Intellectual curiosity, mere curiosity will do. That's a good enough step to start in. But you need to have something that is looking for something, and that we call as aspiration. Now you add that aspiration to this mix, right? So what did I say? Open plastic mind. Second step is to meditate, muse, contemplate about whatever you have read and integrate that knowledge in your mind. The third step is aspiration. Now, as I said, aspiration, a mere curious query in your head saying, is this so-called divine with a capital D, is it true? Is it true? Can I experience it? Am I fit enough? Right? Now, it's this query, it's this question that we call as aspiration in the very early stages. As you progress further, it takes better and better forms, but we need to start somewhere, and it is this aspiration which is going to be the catalyst that will help you derive the most from a work like Synthesis of Yoga, or from pretty much whatever Sri Aurobindo has written, right? It's this that's going to open doors. Aspiration. Now, when this aspiration intensifies, you will know that it's like a thirst. It's like a call that's going out from your being. Now, when I point to my heart, sometimes for some people it's the heart, for some people it's the mind. It takes various forms. We'll get to that separately. But what is important is there is a quest. You want to know, you want to see, you want to feel these ideas that he has put forth in this book. Now, this blind quest, it is natural, it is a normal starting point for many. It was for us long ago, and this quest, I would say, is not going to be satisfied overnight. For some people, there's a certain amount of gestation period that has to happen. These ideas sink in and they go do their thing. The gestation period could be either short or long, depends on your level of development. But unfailingly, it took us a decade and a half, took me a decade and a half. It took some of my mentors much lesser time. But the change comes, the answer comes. And how does it come? Right? The answer comes where there are things that are happening in your being. Your consciousness changes overnight. There are many different ways in which you experience it, right? Where you read something from this book, it has integrated, you've done your thing, your aspiration is on, and perhaps you go sleep, go rest for the day. You wake up in the morning and you see you're changed. Now, don't ask me how. Well, that's how the consciousness works, right? Faculties that you didn't have take birth in you. Difficulties that were there for decades perhaps vanish overnight. There's a whole bunch of things that happen. Now, all of that is the experience that we are looking for from someone like Sri Aurobindo or from a book like Synthesis of Yoga, right? Now, what has happened? When you get to this particular milestone or this experience, what has happened? What has basically happened is you were singing along like a songbird in the middle of nowhere, and none were answering your call. But if you go through this process, whether short or long, an answer comes, and the answer is by experience. It's not because someone said, okay, you wrote a great blog post, you understand Sri Aurobindo so well. All of that doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. What matters is experience. You experience the states of consciousness that Sri Aurobindo is speaking of. You experience its joy, its power, its light. There's a whole world that is waiting for you to explore and see and become. Right? Now that's what this book can do, which means that we are very, very excited to share it with you. And regardless of your starting point, regardless of your earlier disposition, we welcome you to join us for this little journey, right? So there's going to be a blog post accompanying this video, which I'll release in a couple of days perhaps. The impulsion that came to us was that we need to do this today and release this today. So we are following it. So that said, if you have any questions, queries, please drop it in the comments, or reach out to us on Kali's Brood handle on Twitter. Happy to answer any questions that you might have. I wish all of us good luck in reading the senses of yoga and in whatever sadhana practice you may be doing. So with that, I conclude this little presentation. Thank you, and may Agni lead all our journeys. Namaste.